There you go. Becky Shoemaker's here. We named this series after Charlie. Charlie was a huge advocate of us having winter events to keep the community together and to learn some things. If it was up to Charlie, we would have every single one of these about sailboat racing, Genoa twist, what kinds of Dacron and Ensign Genoa, et cetera, But we've had America's Cup events, Volvo ocean race events.
This is perfect.
Even last month, you got to hear about our excellent adventure down south. So we have another one coming up soon, but we do this in memory of Challenger, Charlie Zenson, and Charlie Shoemaker, Dr. Shoe, the sailor. So I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, Keith Stokes. I had to write this down because he's done so much, and including working with us quite a lot through the years. Keith is truly dedicated to public service here in Rhode Island. As an elected official, as well as leading various local, regional, and statewide agencies, Keith Stokes has strived to create a community for all who call our ocean state home. I got to see that firsthand, working with Keith as he helped Sail Newport land not only the 2012 America's Cup World Series, but the 2015 Volvo Ocean Race stopover. His past employment experiences, including being the director of the City of Providence Department of Business and Economic Development, the executive director of the Economic Development Corporation of Rhode Island, and the executive director of the Newport County Chamber of Commerce. He's also been an advisor for Rhode Island with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and served on numerous local, regional, and national business and public boards, including the Preservation Society of Newport County, Touro Synagogue Foundation, Rhode Island Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission, Historical Review Board. I think that's all one thing.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
one bureaucracy.
I was looking for a comment, it just wasn't there. The Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, Quonset Development Corporation, Rhode Island Foundation, and the American Antiquarian Society. Throughout his adult life, Keith has been the consummate steward of African American history in Rhode Island. Woven into his formal education and diverse business experiences are the stories of a generation of ancestors whispering long shared stories of a time before the American Revolution and the lens to see the present. Ladies and gentlemen, Keith Stokes.
That was something. Thank you. Okay, and you want to help me set this up?
Yeah, I think you just go next era.
Let's see if it'll do that. It did it. Great. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to try to provide about 4 centuries of history in about 35 minutes, which will be a bit of a challenge. But before I begin, I want to recognize my wife's here and her team. The Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, if you don't know, is one of the oldest continually operating Black Heritage Societies in the United States, dating back to 1975. They have over 10,000 individual items of collections that date back to the Colonial Era. Now, over the last several years, we've worked really hard to not only to restore and preserve these collections, but now digitize them. And what's particularly exciting is in 2021, Rhode Island General Assembly passed a law. We will be the first state in the nation to have an African heritage history curriculum for all K-12 schools. And my wife and team are working on that. And we're just really exciting. And you're going to get to have a sneak peek at many of the objects that have been digitized that are part of this particular discussion of African mariners. Now, the one thing I'm going to state very clearly and consistently, and I'm doing this on behalf of the African men, women, and children that once graced the shores, they called themselves African, and the term that we're going to be using is African heritage, not black or colored or Negro or persons of color or BIPOC, African heritage. And the term African heritage is absolutely essential because it recognizes the fact that they and we today of African descent are part of a larger story. We're part of a larger diaspora. And in fact, as we begin to kind of weave this story in this presentation, you'll find that the Africans that arrived here either kept or in many cases after enslavement reclaimed their African traditions. In fact, Newport, and one of the things I think we all love about Newport, the sailing and the ocean, the bay, but also people don't realize Newport has more pre-American colonial structures than any city in America. That's Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, Savannah. It's Newport. And what's most important is that with the work of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society and other institutions, we are now reinterpreting the stories of those structures and homes. And in fact, some of the most important sections of not only Newport, but the nation originally started as African heritage communities. In Newport, if I could take you back to the colonial era, the first and largest and most active African heritage community is what today we call the Historic Hill into Bellevue Avenue. If it was Providence, it's College Hill, where Brown University is. In Boston, it's Beacon Hill. So it's important to recognize that as we're now reclaiming these stories and histories, this isn't just simply African heritage history or black history, it's the history of Newport and Boston and Providence, the history of America. And the more that we know of the early men, women, and families that came here, some by choice, some less than choice, the more we kind of know and appreciate our history. So that's kind of a preamble. It's African heritage, and you'll see that embedded in this presentation. Now, before I begin, we're going to have one fun thing. This image here of this gentleman, at the end of the presentation and Q&A, I want you to ask me about that particular picture in its evolution. So I don't want to forget, but so someone's going to remind me about that particular portrait, which is right here in Newport. So let me begin by the first part of this presentation. We're going to talk about the transatlantic slave trade, African enslavement, and then I'm going to move away from that very quickly and talk about the Africans themselves. But it's important to recognize that what we today recognize as the transatlantic slave trade in the movement of over 12.5 million African men and women and children from the continent of Africa, from Old World to the New World, to the exploration and settlement of the Atlantic world in the Western Hemisphere, it took place over 3.5 centuries. And we know from facts that out of that 12.5 million people, close to 10 million would eventually arrive here enslaved. We also know that by the numbers, half of that 10 million are landing in South America. In fact, as we were British North America, we believed that at the best, at the peak, about 150,000 enslaved Africans during that founding era, that colonial era, would eventually land in British North America in places like Newport, Bristol, Providence, Boston, Philadelphia, Salem, New Hampshire, New London, Connecticut. And what's most important is that this transformation is unlike anything at the time in the world. In fact, one of the things that we're always correcting people, because I get challenged all the time in social media, well, there's always been slavery. Everyone's been enslaved. Well, that's factually true. But the difference is what separates African enslavement during that time as compared to slavery in antiquity is the fact that it is a chattel enslavement for life. If you're a child born to an enslaved mother, you were enslaved for life. There was no options for you being free, working off a debt, supporting your master or mistress, serving them in war. So if you were born to an enslaved mother in the Western Hemisphere and in British North America, you yourself were enslaved for life. So it's important separation. Now, Newport's piece of that 12.5 million people, and we're going to talk about it in a few seconds, is very much tied to the transatlantic trade. In fact, this very famous print from 1944, and it's the sailing vessel Sanderson. And this gets reprinted in encyclopedias, in social media, in school curriculums. This is like a standard map of the transatlantic slave trade. And what you see here is very much what that triad trade would be. Ships leaving Newport to West Africa, and from West Africa following the Middle Passage to the West Indies, and eventually back to Newport. That's the transatlantic triangular trade. But one of the things we've been able to do with the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society is really start to cull primary, secondary records to begin to rebuild and really have a sense of who owned those ships. What was the products and services beyond human property? How was human property traded along the West African coast? And then why brought to certain location the West Indies? In fact, I've had the honor over the last several decades to physically travel to Jamaica, Curacao, Bahamas, Dominican Republic, Ghana, Jamaica. As my wife and I will say, we've never been to the resort in any of those locations. We're almost always in archives, in urban areas, figuring it out and working with scholars on Newport and Rhode Island connections. But what's most important is, in the case of the Sanderson, is we have significant records that have been recovered of that ship. It's built in Portsmouth. It sails at least 6 documented slaving voyages. But what's most important is, as we've been traveling to Jamaica and Barbados, there the Newport and Rhode Island records provide. There are ship log records in those locations. We're in Ghana with the University of Cape Coast, and there are ship log records and interpretations of Rhode Island vessels and Rhode Island merchants landing in what at the time they called the Gold Coast, today we recognize as Ghana. And in fact, one of the things that we were able to do for the first time is put together a very detailed list of all existing documented slave voyages tied to Rhode Island. There's been a lot of embellishment around that. In fact, most will focus on individual characters, James DeWolf, John Brown. The reality is that neither one of them are the most active slave traders. It's Newport. In fact, during this work, we found over a 100-year period between about 1705 to about 1807, give or take, there were 934 documented voyages. There's certainly many more. But documented voyages, meaning we had ship logs, we had records, we had probate, we had a lot of information around that from a primary perspective. And out of that 934, as you can see, 74% is coming from Newport. So yes, Rhode Island as a colony, as a British colony, was the most active slave trading. But it's Newport that far exceeds any other community. In fact, Newport merchants are so adept at this work, they're specifically sending their slave vessels to very specific West African countries for the purposes of transporting very specific Africans either back to New England in trade skills or from places like Bunsound and Sierra Leone, because at that time, those Africans were some of the great rice cultivators and farmers and technicians of that time. We're not creating rice here. No cash crops going on in New England. So those Rhode Island ships are sending those Sierra Leone Africans to places like Savannah and Charleston. They become a part of the rice plantation economy of the 18th century at that time. In fact, the Gullah language, anyone had kids or grandkids, Gullah Island? The Gullah language, which comes from Sierra Leone, was one of those creative survivals of Africans who were stolen away, but still maintained some level of their culture, their identity, and their language. So it's important to recognize that these Africans that are taken by Rhode Island vessels, they're not blank slates. In fact, the term that we're using to this day is forced immigrants, because when you think of an immigrant, you tend to think of someone who's bringing their language, their religion, their culture, their food stuff. They're bringing a lot with them as they come from old world to new world. Well, these Africans are the same. They did not arrive as blank slates. They had language, they had culture, they had identity, and they brought that with them. And that's been lost in history. And through the work of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, we're beginning to take a look at slavery, not from the lens of the enslaver, but from the lens of the human beings that survived and persevered despite enslavement. And Newport's role is so specific. Everyone is talking about Newport at that time. This is John Brown himself suggesting if there's any place that's building wealth, it's Newport. And in fact, you see Obadiah and John Brown actively participating in joint slave vessel positions. In fact, there's no single person who's investing and succeeding in slave trading in the transatlantic trade. There's no Dun & Bradstreet. There's very little insurance systems. You're on your own. No one was going to risk their own personal wealth and reputation. So there's always partnerships. The Browns, the Sterries, the DeWolfs are partnering with the Vernons, the Wantons, the Lopez, and Newport, and vice versa. In fact, in 1765, Jewish merchants in Newport, led by Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, Aaron Lopez, come together with John and Obadiah Brown, and they create the first cartel business called the United Spermaceti Candle Making. And here in Newport, and then later Providence, we're producing spermaceti candles. Spermaceti candles at that time, just to get a sense of the innovation and the technology of the men at that time in the industries, spermaceti whales off the coast of the Azores are mid-sized whales, and they're literally caught and brought to places like Newport, to Goat Island, because it's a very messy business, where the brain matter is carved out and then brought over for boiling houses along the waterfront and then cured into candles. The spermaceti candle was the ever-ready battery of the 18th century. It lasted 5 times longer than beeswax and other materials. And it's these men in Newport and Providence, different religions, different backgrounds, different interests, but are all coming together to profit and to invent opportunities in the market that had never existed before. And in fact, one of the most interesting aspects of this is that these men are so involved and create so much wealth in a fairly short period of time, they're celebrating it. This is one of my favorite slides because it's based on a quote from a Quaker woman in Newport who kind of bemoaned the fact that nearly everyone in Newport, regardless of religion and social status, is involved in slave trading. Everyone. And she suggested that so is the custom of wealth that keeps men blinded. And in this very famous portrait, if you haven't seen it, you should look it up. It's from 1755. And Greenwood painted this based upon his experience of watching largely Rhode Island sea captains and merchants carousing and having a good time in Suriname. And what's fascinating about this particular image, if you look very carefully, is the fact that it's equally representative of all religions. So if anyone tells you, and it's a false narrative, being the vice chair at Turtle Synagogue in Education, Aaron Lopez participated in slave trade, as did Jacob Reeves Rivera. It had nothing to do with their Jewish faith. They were 18th century merchants, as were the Anglicans, the Quakers, the Baptists, the Congregationalists. In fact, the earliest and most active slave traders in Newport, which represented the majority of the population, are Quakers. My late Newport grandmother used to have a great saying about Newport Quakers, 1 foot in the counting house and 1 foot in the meeting house, because they were very commercial and very focused. And when the Quakers decided to leave slavery, many good Newport Quakers became Anglicans, such as Joseph Wanton. So it's important to recognize that this was an equal opportunity employer. Everyone participated because of the vast wealth that could be made and vast fortunes that would build family legacies for generations to come. But it is false narrative, it is false history if we single out John Brown of Providence or James DeWolf or the Jewish community or Quaker community of Newport. Everyone participated, some more efficient than others, but nearly everyone participated. And again, what's fascinating about this particular painting, if you look very carefully, Nicholas Cook, who goes on to become a governor in Rhode Island, is the man, at least what Greenwood suggested, is the man that is smoking the pipe with a hat. And then you have Joseph Wanton, a Newporter, who's a Quaker and a slave trader, and actually has to go before the Quaker Meeting House and disclose, I've been in the West African coast, I've been a trader. He's the one that's pouring the drink over the sleeping Stephen Hopkins of Providence. Stephen Hopkins would go on to be one of the 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence. His home still stands on Beverly Street. The point is that these are founding fathers of Rhode Island and the nation. These are the elite families, but their wealth, their station, all comes through active participation in dominance in the transatlantic slave trade. So where was this trade? And where was it situated in Africa? And this becomes very important. Again, having the opportunity to be invited to be in Ghana, at the time of the 18th century, it would not have been Ghana. It would have been called the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast today would have represented parts of northern Nigeria, the Yoruba-speaking people, and all of what is today Ghana, the Ashanti, Akan-speaking people. What's most important is that in Ghana, several of the most important colonial slave forts still exist. The one that is most important for Rhode Island, New England generally, but particularly Rhode Island, is Fort William and Ananabo. My own ancestors were taken from Ananabo to Jamaica, and then eventually Jamaica to Philadelphia to Newport. And they're enslaved by Quaker families and trained by Quaker families, so you see why it's rational and reasonable to see the Philadelphia-Newport connection. They already have trade, business, religious relationships. But what's most important is that the Fonte leaders, the coastal leaders of Ananabo, that small village, actually have a term for Rhode Island merchants. They're called rum men, because the exchange for human beings was with hogshead barrels of rum. And in fact, Rhode Island would dominate that trade like no other. In a few minutes, we'll talk about how they even become even more involved with African chieftains in extraordinarily connecting themselves in seizing Africans for transport. But what's most important is that these African people, the reason that we know it's Ananabo is because of the ship logs and the records, but we also know from just common historical sense. British North America is British. We are trading and doing business in other British colonies and settlements, not Spanish, Dutch, or Portuguese. We're at war with them. It's not Dutch. So what is today Ghana, what was called the Gold Coast, or Sierra Leone, the Rice Coast, are English strongholds. And then those Africans who were seized and transported to other English colonies and plantations in the West Indies, Barbados, Jamaica, Bahamas. It's not Cuba, it's not Dominican Republic, it's not Haitian, it's not French, not Spanish, it's English. So it begins to get a sense of how these colonies are connected and how Newport plays a very central role. In fact, a few years ago, my wife and I were invited to Barbados to work with the trust there. And one of the most fascinating things of Bridgetown, Barbados is that many of the street signs have Newport names, Newport family names. But even more importantly, possibly the most consistent portrait that you see in Barbados is what is called a Rhode Island Narragansett pacer horse. Narragansett pacer horses were bred here in Rhode Island, what today we call South County, would have been Narragansett County at the time. These were mid-sized workhorses that were bred specifically in Rhode Island for the purposes to be shipped to Barbados and Jamaica to be the workhorses in those communities. John Brown underwrote, all the leading families, the Fairweathers underwrote this. But today in Barbados, one of the most important aspects of their colonial economy that drove that economy are these pacer horses. That also provides a very specific connection, or in today, a reconnection to a slave economy, a work economy between faraway Barbados and here within Newport. The other aspect that's so important to recognize, as I said very earlier, because these weren't just simply chattel property. They had lives, they had families, they had identities. The fact that so many of the Africans that landed here came singularly from the Akan-speaking people. Many of them brought with them or reclaimed much of their religious and their social and family customs. The one custom that remains and is relevant today is the Akan day naming custom, based on the day of the week that you're born and other unique aspects. My ancestor's name was Otaba, which means to stay put, which he did not. That gets anglicized or phonetic into October. If you're a boy that happens to be born on Friday, your name is Kofi, K-O-F-I. We phonetically pronounce that as Cuffy or Cuff. There are thousands of Cuffys in Newport. There are hundreds of thousands in Jamaica. And you see it as Cuff, Cuffy, a Y, an I, but it's the day name. If you're girls, you can see here, a Joba becomes Juba. But what's most important is that as these Africans, once they became free, they're not only reclaiming their day names, many would become Christians and would take a Christian name, but would reclaim their day name and then pass it on to their children and grandchildren. Probably the most famous Cuffy is Paul Cuffy. His father, from what is today the Gold Coast, Ghana, he's enslaved by the Slocum family. His name is Cuffy Slocum. His son, Paul, is named Paul Slocum. When Paul becomes free and a mariner and a captain of his own vessel, he decides that in reference to his family's identity, he drops his Slocum slave name and becomes Paul Cuffy. Today, Paul Cuffy is recognized as one of the most prominent early African mariners in American history, who spent lots of time in Newport, worshiped as a Quaker in Newport, was very tied to Newport. But it's the Cuffy name that is so essentially important to be recognized to this day. The business of slavery, as I hinted on, is anchored in rum. Again, this is New England. We have bad weather, bad soil, no cash crops going on here. Rice, tobacco, coffee, none of that's happening here. So for the most part, where our entrepreneur, sailing, merchant class families, they're creating after products. They're taking raw materials of certain products and making it into something of value added. They're taking sugar and making it into rum. Aaron Lopez and John Brown, during the sugar tax, decides if we have to back away from sugar, then let's import cocoa beans and let's grind our own chocolate. And they become major chocolate grinders. Not the chocolate that we taste today, a little bit more bitter. But they're doing these things. Sephardic Jews who arrive as merchants from Spain and Portugal, they're bringing their products and they're producing Castilian soap in Newport. Not in Providence, not in Boston, not in Philadelphia, but Newport, because they're here. But one of the most extraordinary aspects of this plays out in the decades leading up to the American Revolution. As we all know, the American Revolution was fought because of what? Taxation without representation. How dare the British Crown tax us, zap us of our economic resources, and not give us a fair standing before Parliament. But they did. And in fact, as you can see here, the Sugar Act of 1764 would have devastating consequences, particularly to Rhode Island. In fact, Josias Linden, governor, Newport resident, slave owner, would write to the British Board of Trade a long letter which exists in the Rhode Island Historical Society archives and states simply, our colony is small. We're about 40 miles long, maybe 20 miles, 30 miles wide. Our soil is barren. We can't grow much of anything except corn and self-sustaining products. Our trade, our value, our contribution to the crown is the sugar trade, which includes rum distilling. In fact, he points out in very specific detail in that letter, we have 30 rum distilleries in the colony at that time, 24 in Newport alone. We are representing about 80% of the Guinea rum market. And if you tax our sugar and disrupt this trade and costs, it's kind of like tariffs today. It's kind of like the potential impacts tariffs might have in trading partners and commodities. Well, that was the issue Josiah was pointing out, that if you tax us this way and don't give us a voice to defend and present how this tax will impact your sovereign citizens in the colonies, you're going to put us in a circumstance that might simply lead to separation. So it's important to recognize the fact that rum plays a very central role, and the basic ingredients of molasses and sugar play a very central role in New England, particularly. And in fact, the term rum men is a fonte description of the Rhode Island merchants, because once their ships arrived and was around merchant, we're going to get a lot of rum. So it's important to recognize that this black trade has significant importance to the fact that the transatlantic slave trade survived for 3.5 centuries, transporting over 12 million men, women, and children, because every race, every ethnicity, every religion, every country was complicit and participated. That's unlike any time in slavery in the world, where there was this united effort to take a single group of people from one continent, because Africa is a continent, not a country, and transport them to the Western Hemisphere for the sole purpose of free labor and economic opportunity. And I want to point out the fact that as a part of this black trade, it gets even more complicated. African tribal leaders are not only selling fellow Africans willingly, I mean, literally, Fonte leaders are engaging Ashanti warriors to march inland, raid villages, drag back as many captives, place them in cells in the dungeons of like Cape Coast Castle, Elmina Castle, Fort William, and then Rhode Island merchants would pick from the lot the ones they thought were the healthiest and most interested in need, and then everyone was compensated as a part of that train except the enslaved. The other aspect that we find is that that transatlantic trade, that would last somewhere around 9 months to under a year. I mean, from ships leaving Newport, landing in the Gold Coast, and then from the Gold Coast they gather their enslaved men and women and children, and then that middle passage, another at least a month and a half to Jamaica, to Barbados, and then back up based upon prevailing winds. At the time, it was called the white man's grave, because white sailors were dying in droves. Well, first of all, it's a tough business. I mean, to be a mariner at that time, your life expectancy was relatively short. But even more importantly, many of these European-based mariners had no natural immunity to West African diseases and certainly West Indian diseases, the malaria, the yellow fever, and such. So they're dying in droves. So it's Rhode Island merchants. Later we see it in Massachusetts and elsewhere, but particularly Rhode Island merchants say, wait, we are training enslaved people here in Newport to be barrel makers, tradesmen, to work on our vessels. They have a natural immunity. They also have language and logistics capability. Let's place them on our slave ships. So you begin to see, on a consistent basis, African men serving on slave voyages. They're serving as crew. They're providing logistics, translation, and they have survivability. And as you can see here from this slide, this is one of a number of records that we've uncovered of actual Africans. Not even African American, Africans, who they themselves were once enslaved, are now serving on these slave ships, on slave voyages, and becoming further complicit in this horrific chapter in human history. And by 1791, in a few minutes I'll tell you how this group even organized, you have free Africans in Newport say, hey, we got to stop this. They're sending a letter. Free Africans in Newport are sending a letter to other free Africans in Philadelphia, Boston, Providence, New York, and saying, we can't have our people doing this. We've got to stop this. This is wrong. We have to step up and somehow correct this. And they do. They actually start to restrict them as they return. You can't be a part of our community. If we have religious and we have meetings and social life, you can't be a part of it if you're participating in selling fellow Africans. And if you read this letter, which is really fascinating, they're calling themselves Africa and Africans. And in the end, they're even kind of making a statement of the fact, Europeans call us Negroes, we're Africans. They're making a state to the fact that we are now free African people in places like Newport, and we're now starting to exercise this authority. And the first thing we need to do is stop our complicity and participation in the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm not going to talk anything about slavery anymore. I think you've got a good sense, a platform of how it evolved, our participation, and the expansive nature of it. Now I want to talk about, starting with this slide, is the great emancipation, the first emancipation that nobody talks about and recognizes. Today, when we talk about the emancipation, the end of slavery, we default to President Lincoln, the 1863 Emancipation Act. We default to the end of the American Civil War, which is true. The end of the American Civil War in 1865 freed the remaining nearly 4 million African American men, women, and children in the American South. But starting in 1777 in Vermont, and then carrying through over the next decade and a half, the newly minted United States in the North and particularly New England would either immediately and gradually abolish slavery. By the end of the 18th century, you have for the first time in now America, the United States of America, 250,000 free Africans. And these Africans, unlike their counterpart in the American South, they have access to education, because to learn a trade skill, you have to have access to language and trade. My ancestor in 1795, be my great-great-grandfather, in 1795, he's emancipated in Jamaica, sent to Philadelphia, and at the age of 8, he's apprenticed as a Windsor chairmaker to John Chapman, who was the manager of the Quaker Church. And then later he becomes a cabinet maker. And he has access to trade skills, learning skills. Why? Because in Philadelphia, cabinet making is an important commodity. They don't need this young boy to work in a sugar plantation or a coffee mill or a tobacco. We're not doing that in Philadelphia. We're Quakers and we're fine furniture makers. And in here in Newport, what are enslaved and later free Africans doing? Furniture making, candle making, all the trade skills. So these free Africans that are now free by the end of the 18th century, they have trade skills. Many have converted into the religion of their master and mistress, which would have been unheard of and unnecessary in a sugar plantation. And then the third most important piece is they're reclaiming their African identity. They're beginning to think in terms of, now that we're free, what are we? Who are we? We're not Americans. There's no such word as African American. So who are we? And what they begin doing is forming their own African institutions. Possibly one of the most important dates that no one talks about here in Newport or anywhere in America is November 10th, 1780. On that date, 22 African free tradesmen come together in the home of Abraham Casey. Abraham Casey is a master chocolate grinder, initially enslaved and trained by Aaron Lopez, now free. And in his home, which does not stand anymore, it would be the parking lot of the post office at the corner of Memorial Boulevard and Thames Street. That entire Memorial Boulevard, when I was a kid, that was Cannon Street, Bath Road. That whole area were early Africans and later African Americans. That was an African American community up until urban renewal in the 1960s. But most importantly, they come together in his home and they form for the first time in world history the Free African Union Society. We know this because their minutes and records still exist in the collections of the Newport Historical Society and Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. And this society did 3 very important things. One, it created their own internal census. It had to decide, since we are now Africans in America, we need to be able to know who we are, where we came from, what tribe, what language, what's our trade skill, what's the level of education of our kids. We need to know as much information as we can. And it's incredibly fascinating as a nerd to read those records and get a breakdown in 1780, 1785, 1791 of all the now free Africans living, working, and worshiping in Newport at that time. It represented about 17% of our entire population. In context today, people of African descent are about 5% of the population. And that's because of Airbnb and gentrification and things going on, impacting all of us, fortunately or unfortunately. But what's most important is that this African society, they begin to establish an identity for themselves. The second thing they did is we have to make sure that Africans have a proper burial. If you don't know, you should know. Today in Newport, within the common burying ground, we have a section called Gods of the Laker, which is the oldest and largest existing enslaved and free African burying ground in America. There should be others that are larger and contemporary in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, but were all wiped out from vandalism, urban renewal, and neglect. But fortunately in Newport, where we preserve We preserve that section, and my wife and her team have been particularly active with the city in restoring those markers and those stories. But what's most important is by 1787, the African Society in Newport said, we're going to create a burial society following Akan customs. They had minutes, they laid it out, they had rules, they had what they called a sheriff that would lead the procession, and then later you had clergy such as Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles was the minister of the Second Congregational Church, which is on Clark Street today. Ezra Stiles, during the colonial period, was probably one of the most important Renaissance men of his time. In fact, his diaries, which have been translated, still exist. If you ever want to get an incredible bird's eye view of what life was like on a day-to-day basis between about 1760 to about 1775, when he had to skedaddle with the British occupation, you really have to read his diary. But you have to take it as a grain of salt. He's writing it from an interpretation as a European Protestant Christian minister of his time. But he talks in detail about the Africans. In fact, he is literally taking hundreds of Africans. He's competing with other churches. He's competing with the Quaker Meeting House, with Trinity Anglican Church, with the First Congregational Church, the Baptist Church. He's trying to compete, saying, I will convert more Negroes, as they were called, into my church. And he writes all the records, the names, the people and such, who he's converting, who become parts of it. They're all competing for that. But he's also talking about these African burials. In one part he says, there's a burial and there's 400 Negroes. They meet in the center of town, which is Washington Square. They're banging drums, they're singing, they're playing all these instruments, and they're marching out and they're burying their brethren. And then they go back and they have an event, a party. I don't understand that. What he doesn't understand is that is a traditional Khan burial system. In fact, you see that all across the Western Hemisphere as it begins to be, who's going to New Orleans and saw a jazz funeral? Who's going to Bahamas and saw Junkadoo? These are West African traditions that survived enslavement and now have assimilated and become a part of the culture and practice of those countries and those locations. But it all has these early West African roots. The third thing that these Africans did was to ensure everyone would have a proper burials, thus the burying ground. And then later, free African women came together and established an early African school that we'll talk about. So it's very early in America's history, in the history of Rhode Island as a free state, as a part of the United States, but you have large numbers of Africans who are self-sufficient and building an African identity, unlike anywhere else where, unfortunately, if you were in South or the West Indies, you're still enslaved. And in fact, these Africans seize freedom and begin forming organizations, institutions, which they call African. It's an African church, an African lodge, not African American, not colored, not Negro. It's African. That's how they see themselves. And in fact, the center today and historically of the African heritage community is what we call the Black church. Because the Black church is the one place, particularly during times of challenge in racial unrest, it's that one place where you can go and not only worship freely, but you don't have to look over your shoulder. You don't have to worry about a sheriff or ruffians barging into the doors. It did happen, but it was relatively a safe place. And also was a place of not only religion, that's where you had your school. In Newport, the Africans had a literary society later on in the 19th century. They had a school, the Underground Railroad. All the things that were important to them were going on in those churches. And as the African Society was established in Newport, they would send letters and correspondence to other Africans in Boston, Philadelphia, Providence, New York, and say, form similar societies. And why was this happening? Simply because the fact that in the 18th century, the internet of the 18th century is the sea. There's no handheld, there's no social media, thank goodness. Twitter, TikTok, didn't exist. So if you were corresponding, it's the sea, it's vessels. Mariners that were returning from different ports not only brought products and goods in their work ethic, they brought information. And it is no surprise that all the leading African enslaved and later free communities in the north and New England are urban seaports. One, because that's where the work is. And two, that's where they reside and have trade. So as the African Union Society in Newport is reaching out to their counterparts, they're reaching out to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, they're connecting with a man named Richard Allen, who goes on to become not only the founder of the Philadelphia Free African Society, he later becomes a minister and the founder of what is today the first African Methodist Episcopal Church in America, Mother Bethel. In Boston, they're reaching out to a man named Prince Hall. Prince Hall today is recognized as the founder and the namesake of the first Prince Hall affiliate Masonic order in the nation. So what's going on here is that these Africans are not only organizing, but they're creating institutions and identities for themselves, which are the first of its kind in America. And as you can see in this chart, every single one of these early African societies evolved into the first free black churches. First free black churches meaning black owned, black built, black operated, black vestry, black leadership. That's essentially important because that's control, that's ownership, that's identity. And in fact, in Newport, the African society would evolve by 1820s into what is today the Union Colored Congregational Church. Building still stands on Division Street. My Newport ancestor was a minister there. We had lots of things. Most of the people at that time lived or worked in close proximity to their place of worship. So having an active African church on Division Street in the middle of historic Hill would attract lots of African people living in close proximity, as did Turrell Synagogue on what is Griffin Street today. Turrell Street would attract a Jewish community. Think of the Quaker Meeting House at the foot of what today we call the Point, Easton's Point. Very much has impacts of the Quaker community in Easton's Point. So these are reasonable things. When you start to think of history from a reasonable perspective, why do people do the things they do? Because it's available to them, they're safe, it's logical. Well, these Africans did the same things. And as you can see here, the African society in Philadelphia becomes the African AME church, it becomes an Episcopal church. I have ancestors that are members of each of those churches in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. Because why? Because they can. That's where they're safe. They're not traveling south. They're traveling in locations where they know there's a safe place to worship, a safe place to live, and a place where I can own my home and live without looking over my shoulder. So Boston and Beacon Hill becomes a very prominent, important place for free Africans. Providence College Hill is an important place. Historic Hill in Newport. And it plays out well into the 20th century. It's that darn urban renewal that changes things. And we lose historic properties, we lose ownership, and we lose our historic identities. And again, I just want to point out, being a history nerd, these men here are today revered as some of the most important early African heritage contributors to American history. The black founders, as we call, all tied to African societies and all tied to Newport. And the letters between them still exist in the collections. There's a fascinating letter where the Philadelphia Africans have a member, Henry Stewart, and they're asking Newport, can you introduce him to Prince Hall? Because they don't know him, but we know there's a Prince Hall. And then Prince Hall writes a letter back to Newport and says, yeah, well, we know you, we trust you, we'll meet this guy from Philadelphia. It's just fascinating to see this level of connectivity, all tied to being urban maritime ports, because they're exchanging information, and more importantly, they're connecting themselves. Unlike anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere where they're disconnected because of large plantations and countries and lack of communication. So this sets the stage of the next part of this presentation, the African mariners. I think you figured out how they arrived. I think you also figured out that once they arrived, they had early access to training and education, and then they would parlay that into their freedom. So it makes logical sense that this would become a center of African mariner activity. And I think it's important to the fact, almost an irony of the fact, that as I point out here, that the institution of slavery starts with the sea, and then it evolves as a free community and a prosperous community through the sea. And in fact, one of the things that we found, which is again, is extraordinary, is that when you think of the maritime trades at that time, highly volatile, highly dangerous, you're losing people left and right, overboard, sickness, disease, whatever, impressment, you always were replacing people. And what the maritime economy at that time it became a meritocracy where you really didn't care what your background was, as long as you have strong heart, strong lungs, and you could do the work, we don't really care. I mean, think of some of the novels of that time, like Moby Dick. A significant number of the crew are indigenous and African, or a mixture of the two. And what we now find working with scholars is that in the case of Newport, by the end of the 18th into the 19th century, at least 21% of the crew were African heritage people. And later we'll actually see the names of them. So it's this access to the maritime economy that provides access to travel, to wealth, to stability that would have been unheard of and unnecessary in other industries for these African men and then indigenous men. And I should just qualify this because this is something that gets embellished and misunderstood. Indigenous people who survived pestilence, wars, and then forced enslavement. By the end of the 17th century, those indigenous men that survived the King Philip Wars were sent strategically enslaved to Barbados and Bermuda, leaving largely their women behind. And the women who are sharing spaces with enslaved Africans would eventually intermarry, and that is why to this day, many people of indigenous tribes of the Wampanoags, of the Cape, the Narragansetts here in Rhode Island, the Pequots and Mohegans of Connecticut look as much like me versus traditional Plains Indians. Most of us that have multi-generational connections to New England also share that African heritage and identity. So when you talk about terms of African indigenous, in many cases by the 18th century, it's really one person. It doesn't separate. But what's most important is that these African heritage mariners become a sizable force and a sizable presence in the maritime economy. And it makes sense. That's what they were trained for. They're here. They're living in Newport, New London. They're not living in the American South on a plantation or a farm. They're living in urban seaports. So everything about that, they have the training, the preparation, and the capability to succeed like any other person coming in. And in fact, one of the most interesting anomalies, a part of this is, when we think about the Underground Railroad, we think about literally moving from the American South during the antebellum era, those years leading up to the Civil War, and then escaping by land, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, others guiding them, and that certainly happened. But when you think about the colonial era into early 19th century, it's the sea that's the Underground Railroad. And literally what you find is that African heritage men, African indigenous men, are so sought after as crew that those who are enslaved are running away. They're running from one urban seaport to the next, and then they're hiding in plain sight, being a part of an African community and a part of the seamen on a vessel. And in fact, it's the sea that becomes the Underground Railroad. And what happens is that if you're enslaved in Newport, you run away to New Bedford. If you're in New Bedford, you might run to Marblehead. If you're in Marblehead or Salem, you run down to Providence. You're not running south, but you're running logically where your trade and skills and where the numbers are, you can blend in, get a job quickly, and succeed. And it leads to the level where there are thousands of advertisements, runaway advertisements. When we think of slave runaway advertisements, we again default to the South. Usually shows that terrible character of a barefooted slave holding kind of a pack on his back, and he's running and he's leaving a plantation. No, this is New England. What you actually see in 3 examples of this is it's Africans running to other seaports, signing on to ships, and you almost always see in these runaway slave ads in 18th, early 19th century New England, you always see this statement: all masters of vessels and others caution about carrying Negro and penalty of the law. Everyone is complaining of the fact that we know exactly where they're going. We don't know what town or what vessel, but we know they're going somewhere. And they actually start to get very assertive on masters of vessels and owners of vessels who really don't care, saying, I just need a full crew. I mean, I've lost people in the China trade. I'm losing them on the whaling trade. For us that are still involved in transatlantic trade to the West Indies, to West Africa, they're dying. I need able bodies. So what's important to recognize is that it's the maritime trade. It's the sea that brings us here enslaved, but it's the sea that sets early freedom and opportunity, unlike most other enslaved Africans in the American South. And that's a New England story. That's a Newport, Boston, New London story. That's not a Charleston, Savannah, Richmond story. It's a Newport and a New England story. So now I want to give you an idea of who those mariners are, because again, the work of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, able to work with other scholars, we're putting together records. We actually know the names and the deeds and the lives of many of these men and women and children. In fact, in many cases, many of them were so prosperous, they own homes in Newport. Many of these homes still exist, but thus they're probably Airbnbs. But eventually, we'll be able to put plaques on them and say, no, the person that also lived here was an African man or woman in 1810. And they were part of this home, and they were the stewards to preserve this home. But that's another day, another story. The first I'd like to talk about is John Comino. And Comino's a day name, if you go back and remember those names. John Comino did not arrive here initially to become enslaved. He's 14 years old. Let me just step back a bit. Most of the Africans that survived the transatlantic passage from West Africa to the West Indies and then back to Newport are almost always children under the age of 12. Because again, you have to think in terms of, we're not looking for strong men to work on a coffee, sugar, tobacco plantation. We're looking for younger people who we can train and place in trade skills. And between the ages of 12 and 16, they're now a master tradesperson. So younger children, if you look at slave ads coming out of particularly Newport, they're always saying boys, girls, young. Now, and I can't begin to even fathom how an 8-year-old can survive a 9-month passage from West Africa to the West Indies to Newport. They did, but they were a higher commodity. John Comino is in a different circumstance. He's 14 years old. His father is a Fonte chief in Ananabo, and his father is complicit in trading with Rhode Island merchants and says, take my son and help him learn the trade so he can come back and we'll know the language and the trade and we will continue to prosper. They took him, enslaved him. He went into the enslavement of the Benjamin Church family. He's trained as a barrel maker. He becomes a part of Reverend Samuel Hopkins' First Congregational Church and becomes a pious member and converts to Christianity. But more importantly is, as a young man, by 1773, Reverend Samuel Hopkins, who today is recognized as the first abolitionist in America. Our family actually owns his installation sermon from 1770. It's a really neat sermon because Ezra Stiles is delivering it, which sermons back then were like 6 hours, not 60 minutes. But more importantly, Samuel Hopkins, as the first abolitionist, believes slavery is a sin. We need to divorce ourselves with it. He's writing what today is letters to the editors and saying and outing all the merchant class. In fact, he gives an ultimatum to his First Congregational Church. The building still stands. It's a small kind of condo on Mill Street. He gave an ultimatum. Leave the trade or leave the church. They all left and went to the Second Congregational Church. But by 1773, he's writing letters to the newly formed Continental Congress saying, we've got to start slavery. It's wrong, it's evil. Nobody was listening to him. He also believed that once Africans were converted to Christianity, they are equally religiously and socially. Now, even to this day, you see people not necessarily agreeing to that. But at the time, he's a Renaissance man. But in 1773, Hopkins and Stiles come together and they determine, let's train Africans to become missionaries. And let's spread the word of the gospel of Christianity back to Africa. And in the plan, they raise money. They raise significant money. And with that money, you can actually see the guide here to the public. They raise money and they select John Camino in Bristol, Yama. And they ultimately wanted to select a young woman named Phyllis Wheatley of Boston. If you don't know Phyllis Wheatley in Boston, originally from Senegal, would go on to become the first published African poet. And in fact, she's very closely associated with Rhode Island, particularly Providence and Newport Africans. They're corresponding, they're talking. Her best friend is an African woman in Newport called Arbor Tanner. There are 6 letters that still exist in the Massachusetts Historical Society of them exchanging letters about what their life was. But Phyllis Wheatley says, I'm sickly, I lost my language, I don't want to go. So eventually, Bristol Yama and John Camino was sent to the College of New Jersey under the President Witherspoon, a fellow Congregationalist. And today they're recognized as the first African men to attend college. Later it becomes, I'm a Cornell guy, so later it becomes Princeton University, kind of a good school. But in any case, they become the first 2 Africans to be enrolled in college. But a thing called the American Revolution breaks out, disrupts it, they come back. John Camino decides, I still have a wife and children in slavery here in Newport. I'm going to sign on as a privateer and make some money. And unfortunately, he eventually dies. He's killed in the Battle of Block Island. But what's most important is John Camino is very involved in his African community. He's very literate. And this is actually a letter that he sends to the second great abolitionist in America, Moses Brown of Providence. And he's sending a letter to him telling him that I recognize and thank you for your philanthropy, your support of the African community, your support of the abolition of slavery. This is not written by a slave. This isn't written by an African tribesman. This is written by an articulate African heritage man who survived and persevered despite enslavement and rose up to be a significant contributor and an orator to the betterment of his community. And again, the Newport Historical Society, Rhode Island Historical Society, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society has droves of these letters and primary records and diaries and information that tells a whole new story of Africans, but not from the lens of being enslaved. Hannibal Collins is probably one of the great primary stories and potentially myth stories of Newport. He's a real person. We know him. His wife and children are buried in Godswill Laker. We know he fought in the Battle of Rhode Island in the American Revolution, and then as an older man signed up in the war in 1812. We know he was a part of Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry, our great Newport hero. And in fact, he's with Perry when he dies in South America and participates in his funeral. But more importantly, he later becomes a founder when he returns to Newport the war of that Union Colored Congregational Church. And he's a contributor to Newport. And today, one of the great myths that I've talked to scholars all around the country is this very famous painting, this 1865 painting of Oliver Hazard Perry in the Battle of Lake Erie when he's moving across and leaving his soon-to-sink ship and on to the next ship. And you'll see an African heritage man in the back, kind of a scarf. Many scholars have attributed that is Hannibal Collins, because he was his personal servant, his personal friend, and in fact, nearly a third of the crew that followed Perry into the war were Africans, several from Newport. Again, why? Well, it's logical. They had the training, the experience, the capability. You weren't going to take some landlubber to sign on. You were going to take someone who could run that ship, support that ship. And you could care less if they were black, green, purple, do the job. And by the way, you're probably going to get killed or die in a few years. We'll have to replace you. So it's logical, homes, places of worship, and institutions that still stand because of this opportunity. And in fact, one of the most important repositories of this information are what are called seaman protection certificates. Because of the events leading up to the War of 1812, why did we have the War of 1812? Because the British was encroaching on our maritime economy and sovereignty, and they were impressing our soldiers. They had that big war with Napoleon back in Europe, and they needed bodies, and they were seizing American ships and impressing. In fact, we have the records of the African Union Society at that time, the 1790s, and it shows a whole list of who's paid all their dues, then has a whole list taken by the British, taken by the British. So they get relieved from paying their dues because they're gone. So it is an act of Congress in 1796 that creates what is called the Act for Protection and Relief of American Seamen. And it creates literally in all intents and purposes, it's basically your ID card. And it has all the information about you. I'm born in America in Philadelphia. This is my family. This is my name. This is my statistics. I have ancestors that all have seaman protection certificates between Philadelphia, Newport, and London. And it's fascinating in the 1820s and 30s to see where they're going and who they are. But more importantly, today, with the National Archives, Mystic Museum, and Sailing Center, which is incredible, they have digitized most of these certificates. And you can actually go through them and it'll say African, Negro, colored. It'll tell you where they were born, where they sailed. It creates a whole opportunity to understand their lives as mariners. And again, from a perspective of African heritage history, we're having levels of information that we've never seen before or had before, as far as how these men lived, worked, worshiped, and eventually died. And just to give you an example, this is just a sample of African men who were all mariners in their trade, mostly able-bodied seamen. Sometimes there's this embellishment that, well, they're only ship cooks and doing menial work. No. They're able-bodied seamen. They're trained as rope makers, barrel makers. They're trained in all aspects of managing that vessel. And you see that in the records. We cull from the Seamen's Church certificates and others. They're all doing the most important work to keep that vessel afloat and keep the economy running. And I want to stop here because I want to provide a chance for Q&A. I hope the one thing you walk away from is slavery is not black history. If people tell you that, they're wrong. Black history or African heritage history is how our African heritage ancestors survived and thrived despite slavery. Slavery is just how we got here. The story going forward is how we survived and how we continue to contribute to not only the maritime industry, but all industries and really important places like Newport, Rhode Island. So let me stop there. And you know what I'll do, just because I want to go back to this. Remember that picture? We're going to go back to the beginning. Here we go. That's a good-looking man, isn't it? Great photograph. Christian McBurney, who's an historian and an attorney and a great friend, his father, back during the bicentennial in 1976, was looking around in Charleston, Rhode Island, and found in an old kind of whatnot shop. We didn't call them antique shops back then. They were just kind of a little bit of everything. And he found this portrait was really scuffed up sitting there. And he said, well, that's interesting. I've never seen a black mariner from the 18th century. It's an 18th century photograph, portrait. It is. I'd never seen that before. That's fascinating. I think I'll buy it. And he bought it for small dollars. And then he decided, I've got to clean it up. The frame's kind of not so good. It's kind of dark. And he sent it to someone to restore it. And as they were working on restoring it, all of a sudden the black paint came off and it was a white mariner. At some point, someone decided that this should be an African mariner. Now, they did it very accurately. And to this day, he made the decision. Now his son owns this. It's a part of the collection of the Newport Historical Society. He made the decision, African mariners existed. They were here. And let's use this as a very dynamic symbol of their existence and participation. Today, that portrait's used in almost every historical book, historical discussion of 18th century black mariners. but it actually was a white guy at one point that someone painted black, but did it very accurately. And even today, I think my wife and I will recognize that. That could be John Camino. That could be Cuff Benson. That could be Peter Satius. It could be any of them, because again, that doesn't look quite like me. That's an African person, not an African American or person of African descent. That's an African person. So it's important to have these type of imagery, but it's also important to know the true facts and stories, because sometimes it's the embellishment that hurts historical narrative, but it further suppresses what I think is the real pride and need to embrace African heritage history as essentially American history. Someday I wish I was in a position where it's simply American history and hear all the wonderful aspects of it and all the stories within that. So let me stop there.